Hello, I'm Michael Parker, and welcome to Antidote. Today we're discussing 1966 and the 50th anniversary of the rise of the psychedelic revolution. I'm very pleased to be joined in the studio today by a man who was at the center of the storm. He was a friend and confidant to LSD guru Timothy Leary, and as a result of that, he would spend some of his next years on the run for who he knew and what he knew. I'm very pleased to have back in the studio Mr. John Schewel.
Pleasure. Thank you, Michael, for having me.
Thank you for coming on. You were on Sean's show a couple of weeks ago, and everybody thoroughly enjoyed it. So today we wanted to have you back in and dig a little deeper. So the first thing I want to do is take us back to September 19th, 1966, the founding of the League of Spiritual Discovery. What was that? Who was part of it, and what was its purpose?
You know, to best answer your question, Michael, let me give you a little history because the history is important. It was a result. It was a cause and effect event over a number of years. In the late and mid-40s, when a chemist in Sandoz discovered and created the LSD molecule, as soon as it became aware in the chemical and psychological area that this was a tremendous psychoaccelerator drug, immediately the Intelligence Department of the United States of America created a program called MK Ultra.
Yes.
And that was in the mid-50s. And MK Ultra's purpose was to develop and perfect the use of LSD as a weapon, to disable unified battalions of military personnel so that you could disrupt an army, possibly use it to discover the truth or implant a truth. And during that period, the government privately did this and then also did it through grants to programs in colleges. One of them that was selected was Harvard under the direction of a Dr. Henry Murray. And he was receiving funds from the CIA to explore the psychological effects and thus have another environment by which the CIA could get information. At that time, there was a brilliant psychologist who at the Kaiser Foundation in the late 50s had created a document called the Interpersonality Diagnostic Test. And that test was a revolutionary test that was adopted by the CIA, by the NSA. I believe that we even have a picture of the original cover of this document. And the reason I bring it up is because that document and the test from that document wound up being the standard test for any governmental agency, whether it be the military, CIA, or NSA, to understand who this person was and whether we could use them for this or that or the other. And it was based upon this work that was a seminal work at the time that Murray was suggested to go out and get this dynamic new psychologist, Timothy Leary, to come into Harvard and to start to lecture on personality adjustments and personality quality. And he joined with another associate professor, Richard Alpert, who now, of course, we know better as Baba Ramdas.
That's right.
And the two of them were brought into Harvard under this program. I don't believe that either Richard or Tim or later Ralph Metzner really understood that there was a connection at the higher level in the Harvard program with the CIA, but they were independent in it.
You don't think they knew?
No, I don't believe. And if they did know, I don't believe that what they were doing was part of that program. They were part of the legitimate program.
Sure.
Now, in looking into it, they were given the assignment for psychoaccelerators, and that got them involved with psilocybin. And then later, of course, LSD made it into it. And it was at that time that I believe Harvard and the people that had originally funded Ultra MK realized that what Leary and Alpert were discovering was not keeping this in the box, because what immediately started happening was this group started saying, what an unbelievable medicine this is for psychic patients and people who have schizophrenia or addiction. And thus it was leaving the box of being a weapon.
Right.
And so actually it was probably a year or two after they were at Harvard that they were voted out and thrown out of Harvard. By the way, the representative that voted to throw them out on the board was Dr. Murray.
Yes.
And that started a series of events. One, I think that what had happened is it became evident that there were controls, that there were efforts to control these psychoaccelerators. And that the control at that time in the 50s to 60s was a control that was coming out of a weaponization of them. And so when Tim and Richard left, they continued to explore the use of this molecule that they realized was even more could be used for spiritual exploration of the individual. And they went off to Mexico, and that's when they started to look toward ancient texts or other people to help guide this psychoactive experience. And the first document that came out of that was a thing called the Psychedelic Experience. And that book was based upon the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Yes.
And it was the first book that helped you formulate a understanding of what accelerated connectivity of the neurons in the brain are, and how to guide you, much like a ski poles down a ski run, of how to help you guide yourself through this experience. After Mexico, they were invited to a place in Millbrook County, which was upstate New York, by the Hitchcock Mellon family.
Yes.
The Mellon family, of course, of the banking, and the Hitchcocks of polo and also finance. And they were given access to a 64-room house on a 2,000-acre property, in which the Castilla Foundation, and by the way, Castilla came from a Hermann Hesse book.
Yes.
And that was something that continued throughout the entire Millbrook experience, is Hermann Hesse, Aldous Huxley, and using symbols from what they observed as guidances. And then it was at this property in Millbrook that it really started to take even more of a individual's exploration of spirituality. And the second seminal book was the Psychedelic Prayers. The Psychedelic Prayers were based upon the Tao Te Ching, but what was more important in the Psychedelic Prayers was the words became more like koans, more like poetry, and thus were able to be recited during the experience. So they became the first book of a direct guide into the psychedelic experience and helping you adjust and deal with whatever this phantasmagorical event that was being unveiled to you in your now experience. As a result of that, it also became more and more evident that there was more pressure on the period, not only for self-exploration, but also for political exploration, that the government was beginning to say, we'll tell you what we believe you should know and the amount of information that you should know, and by the way, don't question us.
Right.
That, coupled with an obvious move on the freedom of an individual's right to explore their soul, the sovereignty of the individual soul, became more and more evident that there was a clamp down on this, and the government was going to make things illegal.
No free thinkers here.
Yeah, too dangerous. In the name of freedom, we're going to protect you from these terroristic acts that could create chaos within your free nature. So jump on the horse with us and help us limit your personal liberties in the name of what we believe is the good of all. And the individual's right to explore within their own being, their consciousness, became a real focal issue, and that's where it really became evident that in relationship to the United States of America, our wonderful country, that it was under religion, freedom of religion, that this right for individuality. Now, it wasn't the religion of patriarchal or Christianity, but it was the religion of the individual's right to explore their soul.
Yes. So the League of Spiritual Discovery, it was largely headquartered at the Millbrook home, I guess, initially. And did you live there or visit there several times?
Yes,
or?
I had a period of time that I did.
Yeah.
I was going to NYU at the time, doing be-ins, started the first New York City be-in, and then at a wonderful party met two magnificent people at that time, and that was Rosemary Woodruff and Timothy Leary. And it was at that party that I became closer to both of them independently, not even knowing that they were a couple, but they were fighting that night, so they weren't going home together. So Rosemary went home with Richard Alpert, and Tim came home with me, and that began a long-term relationship with both of them over the years that wound up going to Millbrook. And Millbrook was the experimental laboratory for guiding.
Yes.
What do you do on these experiences? A candle, the environment, what to say. And that's where the League for Spiritual Discovery came out of, was the desire to create a religious organization. And we got a religious organization certified by the IRS, and it was one of the first independent religions founded.
Well, let's step back a little bit because, okay, so the League gets founded September 19th, 1966. A month later, LSD is illegal across the U.S. 2 years later, it's a Schedule I drug. Yet people like yourself, Leary, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love out here on the West Coast, you guys didn't shy away from it. I mean, Leary was going around to college campuses promoting it. The Brotherhood was making their own brand, the Orange Sunshine. So why would you guys take the stand that you did with something that was clearly illegal?
Well, understand the period, too. There were two specific things happening at the time that created a tribal effect, again, with the youth. Mm-hmm. One was this right to explore your own soul individually, as long as you didn't go out and hurt other people. And the other was the realization that there was specific manipulation of information given to us from our government. Mm-hmm. So we had these two tracks going on. One was a spiritual track and one was a political track. And it was very difficult to separate yourself from that time, because if you were a spiritual person trying to promote the freedom, you were also within that area of the group that was trying to stop the war in Vietnam. It was all part of the same kind of control.
That makes sense. This picture that we're looking at here, this is a be-in, I believe, 1967 Central Park. The
first New York be-in. We put it together after.
And this is John, by the way, the tall gentleman with the flower in his hair. Who else are we looking at in this photo?
We're looking at, actually, in the front row, there's 4 members of the League, the original League. And it was just, I didn't even know this picture was taken until 1997 on an airplane to Europe, and I picked up a Time magazine, and this picture was in it.
And this originally ran in Rolling Stone, I believe.
This picture? I don't believe this picture ran anywhere until this time.
But we took it out of some article.
No, it was a Time magazine article from 1996.
Oh, okay. Wow, okay.
And so we decided to put together a be-in. We had heard in San Francisco that they did this thing, Being in Love, so we decided to make up posters and do it at the Sheep's Meadow in Central Park. Expected maybe 10,000 people to show up, and by 11 o'clock, over 100,000 people had showed up. And the police and the fire department were all there, but they were totally confused because We weren't protesting anything. Everybody was flying kites. Kids were dancing. Flowers were being thrown.
Fun is always something to be scared of. Wait a minute. They're not rioting here. They're not burning anything. They're having fun. Well, let's talk about Timothy Leary a little bit, because there is so much mythology about the man. I mean, you've corrected me in some of our prior discussions. There have been books that have come out in the last 10 or 15 years where they talk about Leary, they talk about the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, and certainly there's always the rumor, you talk about Timothy Leary, people say, he was CIA. What was the truth about Tim Leary, the man?
The program at Harvard at the highest level through Murray was in fact financed by the CIA. But Tim Leary and Richard Alpert and Ralph Metzner's areas were not at all involved in that. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons they got thrown out was when their interpersonal personality diagnostic part of their lecture series turned into investigating the uses of psilocybin for the personality. They immediately discovered that this three group were saying that the psychoactives were good for medical treatment and purposes, and that brought the use of the drug out of the box of a weapon.
Understood.
So they were fired. And I'm sure that they were aware at some point that there was some governmental movement behind that. But
they were already on their mission at that point.
Yeah, they were already out of the box.
Yeah.
And no, I don't believe that at any time, at least up until pressures many years later on Tim being arrested and thrown back in prison, that Tim was working for the U.S. government at all. If anything, Tim, Richard, and Ralph were working for us.
I understand. Well, let's stick with this, because Tim Leary had numerous altercations with the law. And beginning of 1970, he was looking at a long stint in jail. So those of you, he and some of you around him, conceived the possibility of getting him out of jail. Tell us about that time.
Well, Tim was arrested because his daughter had less than a quarter of an ounce of grass.
And that was on the border of Texas, I believe.
And it became real evident that when Tim and his daughter and Rosemary were arrested, that they gave bail to both his daughter and Rosemary, later dropping the charges, but Tim was kept in prison. So as a result of that, we realized that we had a situation of Tim being in prison, facing a trial, being charged with these, again, real small issues, but that his punishment and the focus on it was more to shut him up politically.
Well, he was high profile.
Very high and the other thing was that, by the way, a lot of us, that we didn't agree with, was his running for governor. That changed a lot of things. It changed the kind of police that were following everybody at that time. Which
you were an avid
local
self-promoter at that point. What I mean is, like, what you're saying, that you guys didn't really agree with him running for president, and I'm saying
governor.
I'm sorry, for governor. Yes, he was stoking the machine a little bit by doing that.
He was doing what he felt was necessary. So, for instance, one of his platforms that really scared the old man Brown Sr., not Jr., was the fact that he wanted to license marijuana, and the license was $1,000 for the year, and the figures that came out of California was they could turn around the entire California debt in one issuance of licenses. Well, that was revolutionary, not only in a solution to economic problem, but also against that thing called the war on drugs.
Yes.
And the war on drugs was and continues to be an executive branch political decision to control protesting.
Well, let me interject, because that brings up the story that hit the news last week, in which John Ehrlichman had supposedly given this quote to a writer that the true purpose for the war on drugs was this suppression of the black community and the anti-war community.
AKA hippies.
Yeah, AKA hippies. Now, the veracity of that is being argued. Some around him are saying it's not legitimate. But regardless, that's what it was.
That's what it was.
Yeah.
And that's what it is. It was then and it is now.
Boom.
And those are the things that we have to be aware of.
Right.
At that time, we put together a defense fund holding together. Rosemary was given the ability on her bail to go to certain places that we felt were necessary to raise money and attention because he was a high-profile political prisoner. And the people that began sponsoring this and falling behind it were incredible. I mean, the most public were people like James Colburn and Yoko and John Lennon. But it went down to intelligentsia. Aldous Huxley, in his last days, had said that this was going to become a political issue, the freedom of the individual's right to explore the universe. And Elridge Cleaver, Bobby Seale, Angela Davis, this whole group was being suppressed and thrown into jail. And by the way, if they could get you on drugs, that is the way to do it, because then it wasn't political, you were criminal.
Sure.
And that's what Richard Nixon did consciously during his particular period. So I am not at all surprised it took this long for it to come out. I'm surprised that this was a directed, willed act by the government to promote freedom to their people under fear.
Right. Well, let's talk about getting Leary out of jail, because, listen, you were in contact with a lot of hip people. I mean, you knew a lot of political activists. You and Rosemary and your group knew the potential for this possibly going south, but you did it anyway. Tell me about it.
Well, Tim wanted it.
Yeah.
And Tim, right away, he felt that this was it, that the government was going to cement him in the wall. And by all indications, they were. So what started to arise is the defense fund became a tool for us to explore what were the elements that we needed to get him out. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting because the people that came and volunteered their services was a wide range of people, but they all shared one thing, that there was an issue here of a political executive branch controlling their citizens for their will. And of course, it was not something that was secret, because what happened with the Vietnam War? It was a lot of misinformation to direct it. So a very amorphous group of people started coming together. And the break was planned. Did we know the repercussions? How could you not?
Right.
How could you not?
Yep.
The participants, I mean, there was a straw polling for who were the ones that were going to pick him up as soon as he got out of jail. And, of course, Jennifer Dorn, Bernadette Dorn, and Mark Rudd drove the hippie bus from St. Louis Obispo to the next stop.
And just so our audience knows, now the way that he got out, he shimmied across a power line?
Yes. We couldn't break him out of the jail.
Right.
He had to get out.
Right.
Now, fortunately, because of the interpersonality diagnostic test, which was still being given to everybody, when Tim got the test, they didn't even know that he wrote it.
Right.
So he answered the questions, and the result was, oh, well, this guy isn't a threat for escape or anything, and they put him in a minimum security prison at St. Louis Obispo. And Tim discovered a high-tension wire that, in fact, went from a part of the prison outside the walls of the gate. And that night, he had worked out enough that hand over hand, he broke himself out of jail.
Wow.
From that moment on, it was a massive group of people from all sorts of different directions of life, from Charles de Gaulle's inner circle to the most liberal law firm in the United States of America, to radical lawyers, to the Weather Underground, to the Brotherhood, who all pitched in and did their part in making sure that once he got out of prison that he could keep getting out.
Mm-hmm. And he went overseas to Algeria?
Well, that was the first escape plan that was part of this particular time was Elridge Cleaver. And because of the connections of getting out of the United States, it wound up that he was given not only asylum in Algeria, but because of the connections to Algeria, he was given an embassy as the Black Panthers. So they had an embassy there. And that became the path by which Tim and Rosemary were funneled into Algeria. As good as that was, it became a disaster because he had to be broken out a second time from Algeria, not from the government, but from Elridge Cleaver.
Right. And so at that point, he goes to Switzerland?
Well, the plan of the breakout was one of our dear friends, I believe, Simon Vinkenhoff. He was one of the heads of the White Party of Holland that created the white bicycle, being able to smoke marijuana in coffee shops.
This isn't an Orion kind of thing. This is something else entirely.
Yeah, but he was one of the sponsors of a big conference on psychology. Mm-hmm. And Tim was invited as a keynote speaker. That was a strategy.
That was the cover.
That was the cover to get him out. That Elridge couldn't deny it because it was a public event. But his path to there never had him arrive in the Netherlands, by the way, where the U.S. government was waiting to rearrest him. It wound up in Switzerland. So, yes, wound up in Switzerland, and it was in 1970 that after all this period of time that I reunited with both he and Rosemary in a ski resort called Valaris, where they both had a house.
Mm-hmm. All right, so... And then at some point, he gets extradited back to the U.S.?
Well, Michael, that happened a little bit later. The sequence of events was with Tim and Rosemary in Switzerland, there was applications for asylum for both Tim and Rosemary. But it became evident on my arrival that the tensions between Tim and Rosemary had been going on for a while, and it was time to separate. Mm-hmm. And Rosemary and I had been close as I had been to anyone since 1967. So the two of us departed Valaris and started in Switzerland separately. It wasn't until a year or so later that two things happened. One was we started to discover that for some reason Rosemary's name was taken off of the asylum paper application in Switzerland, which we thought was strange.
Yes.
Which isolated us further and made us a little anxious because now there was no place for her to secure. Because not only did she jump bail on the same charge as Tim had, but now she was an accessory to a jailbreak and international fleeing. So the charges were being piled up on top of each other. Yes. So we started to disappear into Switzerland and a few other places and redirecting ourselves to explore the esoteric, to start the journey once again.
So this is the point in which you and Rosemary
left.
Made the break. We're out of here. Tim, you're on your own. Figure it out. Because now, did he?
Well, I wouldn't say Tim, you're on your own. Figure it out. That's not how we felt. We all love each other.
I understand that. But let me ask you this: you're saying that her name was taken off the asylum papers. That sounds a little sketchy to me.
No, not sketchy. It was the act of a will, and it sent us a message, and we knew something was up. And then later, Tim gets up and leaves and goes to Afghanistan, which is the last place he should have gone to because it was under the rule of America. And he was arrested and brought back to the United States. Mm-hmm. Now, it was at that time, finding himself back in the United States arrested, that after a relatively short period of time, we received a letter through the channels from Tim in St. Louis Obispo, basically informing us that here is the plan of how it's going forward from this moment on. And you and Rosemary, here's the card of a regional FBI agent. Go ahead and talk to them because it's all arranged and you'll not go to jail and everything will be fine. And that was the tipping block for us, because there were 50 or so people that we all loved. People from a Supreme Court trial lawyer to the head of a major nursing group at a major hospital organization, besides the lawyers, the weathermen, the Brotherhood, that were all being turned over as a chit for Tim being released. One might not think that was significant until you realize that Richard Nixon got the transcript from Tim, and within it, it satisfied all the paranoia that Richard Nixon had, that the liberal lawyers, the radical leftists, the drug dealers, all of these people and socialists and communists were all conspiring to overthrow America. And as a result, John Mitchell was given the job to bring this to trial. Fortunately or unfortunately, if the only witness on the trial was Timothy Leary, you can be sure the defense would have said, well, Dr. Leary, how many times have you taken LSD? And with no corroboration, there was no case.
Right.
So Rosemary and I realized that we had to go on the run for the statute of limitations, which we did for the next almost 10 years in 12 countries.
10 years on the run. You and Rosemary, your family doesn't know where you're at. No one knows where you're at. That's astounding.
Yeah. When you're living it, you just live it. You're in that tunnel and you just move forward. In retrospect, it was a very difficult time.
Well, let's talk about now. I mean, here we are 20, 30 years on. We've got this 50th anniversary of 66 and the revolution, the psychedelic revolution. The war on drugs still exists. But why are you speaking out now? Is there a message here that you need to deliver, or?
Oh, I won't be as bold to say a message, but I've recognized that this is a period of time in which a lot of the same things that were going on in the 60s are happening again. And that a lot of people don't look back in the history to get guidance as to what do we do in these periods of time. And for instance, the words, the war on, there's no more wars. The words, the war on, is now a mechanism by which our executive branch herds people together under fear. And the continuing war on drugs is continuing. Yes, the states are doing this and that, but the federal government has a long way to go before they can declassify marijuana as a one narcotic. Forget LSD, just marijuana, an herb, a sacred herb of, by the way, the tribe that the Americans got rid of, called the American Indians. That has been so implemented into the fabric of law worldwide through the UN that the states can say it's legal, but the federal government's got a big problem to declassify it and take it off of all these treaties, that these treaties were made to promote, quote, the war on.
Understood.
The war on drugs, the war on vaccination, the war on terrorism. It's a manipulative word set that gets people gathered together. And most of us of those 60s, we have veiled the light for the last 20, 30 years. And it's only been recently that there's been a desire of people to understand that period so they can understand more the present. And a number of films, documentaries are coming out now that never would have come out, such as Orange Sunshine, the history of the Brotherhood, but not some book written by a third party with all sorts of
mythologies. And
was actually done by the founders of the Brotherhood. So Orange Sunshine was just released at South by Southwest The head of South by Southwest said it was the first time in the history of their festival that they had to consistently turn hundreds of people away from the 3 premieres of Orange Sunshine.
And just in case we didn't go over this enough, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love was a group here on the West Coast, mid-'60s to early '70s, kind of surfers and jocks that became enlightened and
they started getting high.
Yeah, they embraced him.
Well, because they read the psychedelic prayers, and that guided them to their own miraculous internal self-realization period. Yeah. And they were active enough to understand that we were all being cut off from quality psychoactives. And when you're throwing your neuron system up against the universe with a creative molecule, the most important thing is the source and the purity. And it was that an article in High Times years ago came out called Deal for Real. And in Deal for Real, Tim was laying down the guidelines for the Brotherhood of what the responsibility is to be able to distribute the sacrament or molecules of high quality for self-realization despite the total control of the governments.
Yes.
And that's what they did.
So right now, I mean, within the U.S., you mentioned, the states' rights versus the federal outlook on marijuana. I mean, in 2015, I believe legal pot there was like $5.5 billion in business. And yet the war on drugs continues. And in a way, this is perhaps the intrinsic question here, which is this really just a conditioning of citizens and cutting us off from a right to explore our consciousness? Or what's the struggle here?
The struggle is the creation of a policing agency totally under the executive branch. J. Edgar Hoover, could say a lot about him, but he fought the creation of the DEA. He already felt that the FBI had jurisdiction over that. But the Nixon administration created the DEA specifically for their war on drugs. It was part of their tactics. But because it was an executive branch entity, there were no funds through Congress given to it. Mm-hmm. So they came up with this plan that when the federal government or the DEA, who were, quote, the federal government, but were really an executive branch policing agency, when they were involved with a bust and they included county or state police, that all of the confiscated goods or properties from it would be auctioned off and divided among those policing agencies. Now in the
creating revenue,
which now is billions of dollars.
Yeah.
So when you say that the market for marijuana is billions of dollars, it still pales to the funds and the necessity for local state policing organizations to get these funds from this war on drugs, because there's no replacement for the funds. That is going to be one of the issues that have to be overcome too. Before the federal government then relaxes marijuana. And this kind of history and awareness is really why all of us are coming out and talking now, is to impart upon those that have come later, my brothers and sisters of youth, that it's important to, one, explore your inner self, self-realization. Dissolve, coagulate, perfect that foundation in which you're on, and the responsibility you have to not necessarily accepting that what you're being told is the truth, and to begin to creatively put together your own map for what is necessary and what there is to be done.
John, this has been a stimulating conversation with a lot to think about. And listen, I'm glad you're speaking up. It's an interesting message. It's a vital message to not only the millennials, but to all of us. And we didn't even get into the part about what the media has to do with all of this, which is also an integral part. But Thank you so much for coming on Antidote. I really appreciate this.
Michael, a pleasure. Thank you, and thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, this has been a mind blower. I mean, we've done a lot of stuff on the 60s, but the deal is it's important. I mean, there are things to be taken away from the 60s. And when people use the cliche that somehow the 60s were lost or that, that people just turned into yuppies, I don't really see it that way. I just see it as a culmination of constant change, and certain things really good came out of the 60s. The war on drugs and this recent quote from Ehrlichman, who knows if it's real? I certainly think the actions reflect that it was real, and it's something that we will have to contend with. Our sovereignty of our personal consciousness and the intrinsic freedom that is implied by that. If your mind is not free, what is free? My name is Michael Parker. This has been Antidote. Until next week, you, me, every single one of us, we are the antidote.